So, to begin with, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction into GIS, a little bit more than what we talked about last time. And it's weird. There we go. Yes. And to tell you a little bit about essentially what we're going to be doing this semester. So, the first thing is a definition. So, Geographic Information Systems, or Geographic Information Science, depending on which version of that you use. So systems is kind of going away, and GIS professionals are starting to refer to themselves a little bit more as science, because it's not just about ways of displaying data and holding data. It's the analysis part that's becoming increasingly more common, and that is a significant, and it is a kind of science. In fact, I'm going to expect you guys to do science this semester for your research project. You're going to have to develop a hypothesis that you can test utilizing GIS, and then report on the results. And so that sort of meets the basic premise of science, is that you have a hypothesis that is testable. You design an experiment, or in this case, an analysis of data, and look and then interpret, often using statistics, and we can definitely do different kinds of statistics in GIS to support your hypothesis or not. And that is science, and that's what we're going to do. And in fact, this semester, maybe more than a lot of your other upper levels, I should have had you guys write down what other upper levels you've taken, but we actually are going to talk and think about kind of the nature of science a little bit in here because of what we're doing and sort of what we're talking about. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of science as well, and talk about the history of our understanding of disease and germ theory and things like that. So we will do a lot of different kinds of things. I like this class because it can touch on so many different kinds of areas. And so what is the advantage and the strength of GIS is the ability to combine different types of data and look at them in a spatial sense. So there are enormous amounts of data, and in fact the amount of data that humans generate every single day is staggering. How to manage that data is increasingly becoming a challenge, and what kind of sense we can make out of interpreting data is a huge area. And so one of the skills I'm going to teach you this semester is how to manage data, how to deal with large data sets. And that is basically going to be, I think, now for now and for the rest of our lives, a very marketable skill that you can have, no matter what field you're going into, whether you're looking at a medical field or a biological field or an ecological field or even a business field. How to manage data is incredibly important, and so we're going to talk kind of a lot about that. Now, GIS has evolved and changed a lot over the years. It's not that far back that computers were very large things that people didn't own or even carry around in their pockets, and so GIS developed along with technology. And so without a computer, you can't really do GIS, although people did attempt, or people looked at data in the sense of interpreting lots of different layers and trying to put a spatial context back, basically as long as people have had maps. And so we might think of GIS as being a fairly modern science, and compared to other things, it is, but its roots go all the way back to some of the earliest days of cartography, and you can find examples of people putting lots of different kinds of information on a map besides just the geography back into the 1600s, 1600s, just sort of depending on what you're doing. It wasn't all that sophisticated, but people did what they could, and they were trying to illustrate those kinds of things. So we've moved kind of beyond these things. We can certainly do a lot more than we did in the past. How many of you guys have ever used a paper map? All right. In what context do you guys use a paper map? Hiking, sure.
Amusement park.
Amusement park, yeah, amusement park maps. Yeah, that's kind of a fun thing.
We have no service.
Oh, we have no cell service, yeah. There's places like that. Anybody have a map in their car?
My dad like put one in mine once, and then my phone didn't work, and like I was driving to North Carolina, and I had to use it.
Uh-huh.
I didn't know how to use it, but I was on the phone with him, and he was helping me.
Mm-hmm.
But I had it, and it helped me.
Yeah.
He like was like, oh, I put it in your dash.
Yeah. Used to be, like when I was a kid, our glove compartment was full of different maps that we'd stop at rest areas when you got to a new state. Go in and pick up the map of North Carolina, map of Virginia, and you'd, like take a look at it, see where you were going, and trying to guess. You're like looking at the little dots, like that dot is really small, so there's probably nowhere to stop there. Oh, that's a bigger dot. Maybe we can get lunch there. Not having a phone that you can just look up and have endless amounts of choices about. So as computers have evolved and changed, we've been able to do more and more sophisticated analyses, more and more better ways to visualize and display data. All of that is improved, but we are still dependent upon how we think about maps. And one of the things that I really like about the Cartographies of Disease book that we're going to talk about is thinking about map thinking. And the way that a scientist goes about thinking about the world and thinking about how to represent data is really important. And so we can have super powerful computers and super sophisticated kinds of tools, but unless we're doing the map thinking, what's the question we're asking and how are we going to best analyze it? It's not going to mean that much. And so map thinking is a huge part of what I want you guys to learn, a skill that you're going to develop today. But we have lots of tools that can allow us to do this and to think about things and show things in ways we never could before. So this, I should have probably got a live version of this, but this is what's called a swipe map. Has anybody ever used a website that has or looked at pictures? These are usually used to show changes after a storm. This is in the Bahamas. After Hurricane Dorian hit, you can grab this pane right here and look at an aerial photo of the same area before the hurricane and after the hurricane to get an idea of the devastation. These are pretty common after storms or big events like this. Has anybody ever looked at the website that's done that, given you the tools to look back and forth to that? No? Okay. Well, we'll find some examples today, and we'll talk about that. All right. So there is an enormous amount of power because of the amount of data we can put into GIS and display. Now, GIS works by storing data in databases. It can be made up of a single database or multiple different databases, and then we can display data in the form of layers. And so this goes back to the days before computers, where you could overlay often sheets of acetate, clear plastic, essentially, that had different things on it. Has anybody seen a book or a map that's like that, where you had plastic layers like the human body or something like that, where you could stack up those things on those? Yeah, so they still make things like that. And so map makers started doing things like that. With the advent of computers, you could do that digitally. And so we still talk about layers in GIS. And in fact, you'll see when we get into the program ArcGIS, there's a panel of the screen that has your layers in it, all different kinds of data in there. You can add and remove data, you can turn on and off data to try to show and look at different kinds of things that, whatever you want to display. And so, because everything is digital, you can reuse these, you can do analysis to something and add it to another kind of map. You can resize things, you can show things in different ways. There are some limitations and some other things like that, but for the most part, the sky is kind of the limit. You can You can reuse these data all the time. You can do different kinds of things with it, even in the same map. You can display the same kind of data the same in other ways. And so as we've evolved past personal computers to phones and the internet, GIS has started to evolve as well and is becoming more and more ubiquitous. It's found in every different kind of area, so that you can look right now. This picture here was Washington D.C. Yeah, that's Washington D.C. There's different kinds of data in here. There's the street maps, but there's also locations. There's buildings. There's different kinds of land areas, whether they're the parks or the mall, the rivers. All of that can be displayed in different ways. And we can do that from almost anywhere now. There are lots of places that don't have internet service, but as long as you have some kind of access to the internet, you can access lots of different kinds of data. In fact, the future will be us being able to be connected all the time, and potentially this will evolve into either some kind of virtual reality, or more likely, I think, augmented reality, where you could put on glasses or something that will change your vision so that you can get display. So maybe when I'm teaching here, it will show me all of your names and where you're from and anything else like that, whether you're paying attention or not, how many times you've looked away, like get your attention. I don't know. That's possible, but that's probably more distracting than anything else. But we can answer lots of different kinds of questions. And the first question that GIS is always focused on, and something to kind of keep in mind, is location. What is it? Where is it? Where is it at? Where is it located? All of those kinds of things are an important part of that. So there are lots of questions. There are some questions you can answer in GIS that are not explicitly spatial, but those are not good. They're not the best kinds of questions to answer, because you're kind of missing out on the overall point, which is how does the spatial relationships between things, how does that matter? Or why does that matter? Or what effect does that have? That's what you can do. So location is always important. Now, I've done GIS. I've utilized GIS and looked at spatial relationships on things that are not our geographic realm. When I was a master's student, my master's project utilized GIS to analyze areas of wear on horse teeth. So I was interested in understanding if there were different wear patterns to horse teeth that had been bitted, that basically if they had a bit in their mouth, or if they were wild horses that had never been bitted and their teeth wear differently. It's a spatial question on the surface of a horse tooth. And so whatever the location is doesn't necessarily have to be a street address or a county or a country. It can be something much smaller scale, and you can do things like that. I was there. We tried a couple years ago. I was working with Dr. Fogarty. Anybody know Dr. Fogarty? We were trying to grow some cells and do some microscopic analysis of cell damage and cell growth. We were working with Dr. Grider too, so he was trying to grow some neurons. We were going to try to do some basically image analysis on these. It turned out to be it never even got to my part because it was too hard to grow the cells and collect the imagery that we could use to analyze them. We didn't even get to that part. But if any of you have a project like that where you have lots of image data, you can analyze it this way. There's a different kind of location, but any kind of location can work. Next kind of thing is condition. And so we can assess and document how things are changing. Are things improving? Are things disapproving? Like, where is something located? Where is it now? These are kinds of questions you might ask in an ecological sense, like where are species located? And you do a survey to try to collect count individuals. You guys remember from 2500? Different sampling techniques. You could go out, you could do mark and recapture, you could do quadrat sampling, something like that. Then if you're excited and interested in questions like that, you could certainly develop a project where you do that. But it could also be conditions. This is increasingly an important thing that like utility companies would use. Like where's a power line down? How are we going to figure out where that is and task somebody there to repair it? Or you're reading meters or things like that you're sort of logging regular data. All of that could fall under that. The next kind of thing are trends. How have things changed, or what direction are things moving in? What is there more of something or less of something over time? That could be an important kind of analysis. And then what kind of patterns do we see? This is kind of a key part of GIS, and a very commonly asked question is, what is the distribution pattern of some event? Are there more crimes in one particular area than another? If so, what would our response be? Do we need to send more police to that particular area, or do we need to do other kinds of interventions? Are there more cases of cardiovascular disease in one area of a county than another area of that county? What other kinds of things, what other patterns are there? Are things distributed randomly or things clumped? When things are clumped, you tend to think that there's more of an underlying cause, but if things are distributed randomly, maybe there's a reason for that as well. So a lot of GIS is exploratory. And if you're interested in asking questions, it's important to take some time and explore your data. You might not know what questions you really need to ask until you've seen what your data looks like in a spatial sense. And so all of your projects, as you develop them, they're going to change and evolve a little bit as you play around with them and you see. You may have a very specific kind of question, which is great, but often you might find a more interesting question or something else may come up as you explore your data. And that's the other thing that I think is kind of amazing and powerful about GIS, is that it allows you to try lots of different things. If you're setting up an experiment where you need to grow an organism, like raising flies, and you want to cross a particular, all that kind of things takes time. But in GIS, I can turn off some layers, I can find some new data, I can throw something else in there. Some things take time, and some data is not easy to get in or out of GIS. But I can do often a lot more things than if I'm dependent upon lots of different experiments that could have their own kinds of failures associated with it. So that's a big thing. The last thing is modeling. And GIS, there are some really powerful tools in GIS that can model locations, like what-if scenarios. You can build different kinds of models to do things. One of the things, depending on your projects, we won't necessarily have a lot of time to look at some of the automating tools or model building tools of GIS. We will use some of them. And we will use one in particular, which is called an ecological niche model. And I will show you how to generate an ecological niche model, which now you can do in ArcGIS. We used to have to do it with a separate piece of software called Maxent, which you still can, and Maxent is available. It's a Java app, so it can run on any computer. So if you like it, you can run these things on any computer. To visualize the data that outputs it, you need to use ArcGIS. You need to use some sort of GIS software, but you can run it on anything. But that has been built into ArcGIS Pro now in one of the more recent updates, and so you can run your models right in ArcGIS. It's going to save some steps. Actually, I'm going to have to work on that lab. It's written for older software, but we can do that now there. And so there are lots of different kinds of ways you can do things. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about in just a couple weeks, next week perhaps, is scale in GIS. And scale is really important. It's geographic phenomena happen at lots of different scales. It could be global, it could be local. They're thinking about how to analyze your data and what scale is appropriate is going to be an important part of questions when you're designing your project. There are great questions that you can answer at a national scale. How do we see, do we see differences across our country in educational level, something like that? That same kind of question could be asked about a county. And so what data is available, what scale you're going to ask that question at is important. All right? So quick question, see if you guys, what you guys know about scales. This is a world map, and this is a map of Pittsburgh, just so you know what we're looking at right there. So Western Pennsylvania, there's Pittsburgh. Which of these two is a large scale map? Which one's the large scale map, Gabriel?
Large scale, and we're looking at a larger set of data would be the world map.
Okay, how many people think that this is the large scale map? Raise your hand if you think that's the large scale map.
Wait, now I got that map.
Okay, how many people think that this would be a small scale map? You don't know?
That would be
Feels like a trick question. I think it'd be small scale.
Why do you think it's a small scale map?
Because you're not, like, that would be large scale because you're like zoning in on one specific area.
That is correct. All right, so this is a small scale map and this is a large scale map. You're seeing a larger area, but because you've zoomed out so far, we'll talk about scale a little bit more detail before, but because you've zoomed out so far, it's a very, you're seeing a very sort of small, it's made, if you think about this in terms of the real world, right, because this is the whole planet, and the whole planet, you know, is about 25,000 miles around, and we've reduced that down to, you know, whatever this is, 4 or 5 feet, that makes it very small scale. Right? We've essentially compressed it down. This is still a big area, right? It's the city of Pittsburgh. Actually, this is the city and surrounding areas of Pittsburgh, but it is a larger scale because it's less area that's being compressed down, essentially. So you got to think about it in terms of fractions. And we'll talk about that more. Yeah.
Does it depend on your point of view? Because like you could say that map is large scale in the view of like space.
Oh, I see. Yes, I suppose so. That would be if we were talking about it in terms of like where we are in our galaxy. Yeah, that's true. So it is always relative, right? There's always sort of a bigger and there is always a larger and a smaller scale we could go to.
So more like large scale is in more detail. Large scale is in we can amplify it, that we can see.
Yes. So large scale, basically, yes, you can see more detail. Small scale, you see less detail. Does that make sense?
So when you said like scaling in terms of fractions, like what would these equivalent fractions be?
Well, I'd have to guess.
Like, I'm
But-
saying like comparatively, like very generally.
Oh yeah.
It would be a smaller fraction for the world.
Yeah, because if we were trying to say we were interested in looking at, so in translating these into terms of miles.
Yeah.
All right. So you know, across here is 25,000 miles, 24,900 something, but 25,000 miles, and across here is I don't know, maybe let's say 25 miles. That might be even a little big. But 25 miles. That way we can work in kind of the same scale. All right. If we were representing the same length, like if I hold my fingers up here, how many miles is this, and how many miles is this? Right. We would get a bigger number here. Okay, but it's basically like
You can just make those like the denominator.
they are essentially the denominator of fractions. So we would think about this as as this, and so this is a larger number than this, And we'll talk about different scales of maps and how that works. But this is, since this is a larger number, this is a larger scale map than this is. Yeah.
That's what I was gonna say, it's like if you think of it as 25,025, breaking up into 25 pieces, that's 1,000 per one.
Yep.
That's 1 to 1.
Yep. Yep. That's another way to think about it. Yep, that's good. Okay. So, when we're talking, we're gonna have to learn some terminology, and so I've already been I've been putting in some things that you're gonna need to know. But another term that is important is what's called a feature class, and so these are data essentially, and there's different ways of referring to data. So a feature class is something that we can add to add to a GIS database, and then we can symbolize it and put it on a map, and then it becomes a layer. Okay, so a feature class may or may not have spatial data directly. Once it can be associated with geographic data, it can be put on a map and it becomes a layer. Right? So we can keep a database, and we can store lots of different feature classes. We can represent a feature class in multiple different layers. We can change lots of different aspects about that, but they are sort of a reusable amount of data. And the GIS part is that associated with every feature class is our data, and each of those features make up different fields in a table. So if you think of a table like an Excel table, right, you're going to have different rows and columns. Each of the different columns might be a different feature. Each of the different rows might be a different. Actually, I said that the wrong way around. The columns would be our feature classes, and the rows would be different features. So you might have houses in an area. Every address for the different houses is going to be a different feature, and you might have associated with each of those other data, other classes of data. So it could have first its address, but then maybe its square footage, or its number of people that live there, or the phone number of the house, or something like that. So you could have you can have tables of data that could be associated that way, and they could be linked together with different spatial data as well, and then display that. So what that looks like when we get to GIS is this. And one of the more common ways that we'll deal with data are what are called vector data. How many people have taken physics? All right. What's a physics definition of a vector? Remember vectors? You probably spent a lot of time in physics when talking about vectors.
Something that has magnitude and direction.
Magnitude and direction, right. And so vectors in GIS, a little bit different, but they are data that can be represented through a mathematical equation, essentially. And we have three main types of vector data that we will deal with. We have point data, which are essentially dimensionless data. Data that don't have an explicit size associated with them. So we can go back and forth between these, but for the most part, like points will just represent something that's there. If you open up, say you're using Google Maps or Yelp or something like that, and you search for all the different Mexican restaurants in the town, and it puts all those little dots on the page where those are, those are point data. Okay? We can also talk about line data. So line data points have no dimensions. Lines have a dimension. They have length. Okay? And we can use those for anything that has length. So they're good for roads and rivers and things like that generally that are long. And then finally we have polygons. And polygons are areas. So they have two dimensions. I should state that some of these, if we're dealing with like geographic data, they could also all have elevation associated with them, which might give them some other dimension. But for right now, we'll put elevation aside, and and when we're talking about these on a map, the map is two-dimensional. Polygons, areas have 2 dimensions, lines have 1, and points have none. Okay? We'll ignore elevation right now. And so polygons are actual areas, and so they have they have dimensions to them, and they have area then as well. All right, and so here, this little map of Pittsburgh has some different, these 3 different kinds of things. It has point data for these health centers. Right, so they're located, they're the green on this map. It has line data, it has street data. Now this river data is probably a polygon because it has width to it essentially. These have width too, you can see them, but that is likely an arbitrary value that you can change. You can make it wider or narrower depending on just how you draw your map. So that's a separate thing. Dots you can make bigger or smaller, but it doesn't necessarily have any meaning to them. The size doesn't necessarily have any meaning to them, right? And then polygons, yeah. So those are polygons, but there's also some blue tracks in here. Those may be pools or something. They're blue like the river, which would lead me to believe that they're also sort of tracks for that. All right. So those are vector data, and most of what we'll do will be utilizing vector data. You're going to have locations of things. They could either be points or polygons. You will have potentially roads or rivers or something else that are line data. Boundaries can be line data, but if you're looking at the outline of a shape, that's a polygon. Polygons can have any number of vertices. And so some polygons could be extraordinarily complex shapes, like the outline of a country, the outline of a county, something like that. And so much of the data we will work with is represented this way. The other type of data that we will use are raster data. Raster data are, for the most part, images. So that's kind of the most common kind of raster data, although we'll generate raster data that is not specifically an image, like a picture. All right. Now, a picture is a raster data. So any kind of raster data are essentially a set of different cells that have a value to them. All right. For a digital image, how many people zoomed in on a digital image so that you start to see little squares? Right? What do we call those little squares of colors? Pixels, right. So a pixel in a raster, it represents one value. The bigger the image, the more pixels it has, and the more detail it can hold. And the same kind of thing with other kinds of raster data. Now, in a digital image, like a picture you take with your phone, each of those pixels has a color value, and that's what you look at. If it's a color picture, every different color that it can hold maybe millions of different kinds of colors, but each one of those pixels will be that. You zoom out far enough, you see the picture. You can make raster data that the values, while they may be colored, may represent something else. All right, and so that's what's shown over here. So here we have raster data that shows different types of land use. So each one of these pixels, so the cells that make up raster data are usually called pixels. They have a different value. These colors aren't, what it would look like if you were, flying high above the city. This is what that looks like. And so this is one type of raster data. This is an aerial photo. This is another type of raster data that has classified not necessarily the same thing, but the same area, or at least part, this is zoomed in here a little bit, but has classified it to different types of land use. You can also generate raster data that has some other value. So this is a heat map. I'm not exactly sure what this heat map is. Do I have it in my notes? No, I don't have any notes on that. So this is another kind of heat map that just shows the concentration of something. And so the pixels in this case, the higher the values, the more of something you might want to show. You can take vector data and convert it into a raster this way, and it'll condense where you find different points. So say, common way that this is done is with crime data. If you have point data for where crimes have occurred across a city, you could generate a heat map. It's a raster that more graphically illustrates where those dots are concentrated. Because at some point, you just get a lot of dots on top of each other. And that shows you something, but this could be more useful to show you whether or not there's how many points there are in a particular place. So there's lots of different kinds of analyses that can come with it. We often generate rasters as a kind of analysis. If this could also be potentially what is generated from an ecological niche model. The ecological niche model is going to generate a raster like this that shows the likely areas where you might find a particular species. So this might be, I don't know, raccoons in Pittsburgh, for example. All the red spots are where you might find a lot of raccoons because there's good raccoon habitat, like, I don't know, a lot of open trash cans. So whether you work with vector data or raster data really just depends on what kinds of questions you're asking. And so what kinds of analysis you're doing, what kinds of things you're doing, it's going to dictate that. You don't necessarily set out one way or the other to work with it, just kind of what data you want to look at. Now the power of computers has increased so much that we can also do a lot with three-dimensional data. And we can generate three-dimensional scenes like this, where we have not just the shape of buildings, but their heights and other sort of details of that, and then we can put points in there. I don't know if that's like, I don't know what the colored dots in this case mean. Maybe where people are occupying the building. Maybe it's numbers of I don't know, computers. I don't know. It could be anything associated with that. So we can add 3 dimensions of that. We can even draw this kind of beautiful map of Michigan that shows what the subsurface is like. These are pretty complicated kinds of maps, but we have lots of tools now that can allow us to do that. And so we can utilize 3 dimensions in GIS to either show elevation, which is pretty common, like these buildings, but we can also use it to add other information, like how common is something in there. We can utilize that 3rd dimension to add more detail, not just differences in the 2-dimensional map, but adding a 3rd dimension can help very complicated things be displayed. People can't really see much beyond that, so our analyses might take, especially in an ecological niche model, might have 20, 30 different dimensions. We can't visualize those all at once, so we condense them down to the most important ones and then show those. So, so 3 dimensions can be utilized in lots of different kinds of ways. So, a 3rd kind of area is network data, and this is not like in the sense of a computer network, although it's a little bit related to that. It's in the sense of how interconnected things are. And so you can do analyses to figure out the shortest distance. It's essentially what your phone does every time you search for directions. It's going to look at a number of different variables. First, the length, and how connected the streets are. And it actually has to do kind of a lot. It's like we kind of take for granted now that directions are generally right, but how many people followed directions and not gotten exactly to where you were supposed to go, or it took you on a wrong turn or something like that? That happens. So it's pretty difficult to do this. It's amazing how much it gets it right. But there are different ways that we can connect into that. And so this map is showing distances. I believe, this is travel times. These might be hot. No, I don't think they're hospitals. They're just different kinds of buildings. And so you can see the map is colored to illustrate sort of closeness to different kinds of facilities. These kinds of analyses can be really important if you're trying to figure out whether an area is underserved by a school or a hospital or something like that, or even like grocery stores. Is there a food desert? Because it takes, it's miles till you get to the closest place you can buy groceries. That could be an important kind of analysis that you could do, and that's one thing that GIS is good at. All right, so let's look at the software we're going to be using, which is called ArcGIS Pro. There is other GIS software out there. Most, in my opinion, some people might disagree, but in my opinion, this is sort of the most common. It's pretty much industry standard. There are some other forms. Has anybody else used anything? Has anybody else done any GIS stuff before? I don't think I asked you that. Has anybody done some GIS? You've done some GIS?
In high school.
Yeah, what did you do? Did you use ArcGIS or did you use something else?
I don't even remember. It's been a while ago.
Okay.
But I was in a club for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there are some free versions. There's something called QGIS, which is a free version. We're going to be learning ArcGIS Pro because it's so common, and that I want you guys to be able to talk about it as a skill. And if you really are interested in it, I want you guys to get some certification towards that. So that you can say to an employer who's looking for somebody who has skills in ArcGIS, and they will say that it's pretty common, that you know how to use the software. And we'll get to at least the point where you can use the software, and you're going to be able to do some analyses, you're going to be able to do some stuff. And so this is what it's going to look like. We'll open it up here in a minute to make sure everybody can log in. You won't have all these data layers, and it won't look as exciting until you start putting data into ArcGIS, but this is it. They have, it's much nicer than it has ever been. I really like the user interface on ArcGIS Pro. Works pretty well. This is like the third or fourth different interface that I've used over time, and so far this is my favorite, with a few exceptions. Occasionally I'll try to do something because I remember how to do it in an earlier version. It'll take me a minute, and so we'll check which version we're using. There haven't been huge changes in the interface, so things are mostly located where they are. That hasn't changed much, but some of the tools and how you do things has changed over time. And so sometimes, bear with me, and I get a little bit of a refresher. I do this stuff relatively frequently too, but you can forget these things pretty quickly. But this is generally what it's going to look like, and we'll learn what these different tools do. But it's not too much different. They've designed it now to be not too much different if you're used to using Microsoft Office. Like the toolbar in Microsoft Office is as many buttons or more as this, and they're organized into different tabs like this. You'll find some very similar kinds of design elements associated with it. And there's just a few kinds of things you're going to have to learn how to deal with. Okay, now, once you've created a database in ArcGIS, you're going to be able to start asking questions. And so oops. Did I do that intentionally? Did I do that? Let's say we want to know who are the top polluting companies. Okay, why are you doing that? What is happening? Stop doing that. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. All right. Who are the top polluting companies, and what is their proximity to populations in poverty, or water features, or schools? Okay, we're going to go on. Why is it doing that? So this is what our data might look like. So these are different features in different feature classes that are stored in our database. All right. So here we have the polluting companies. This data came from the EPA. It has the location and how much pollution they produce. This is census tract data. This is what it looks like. And so these are data collected through the U.S. Census and through the community survey that they do when they're not collecting the census. So this tells us information about poverty levels and has state and county. These are all codes that are associated with censuses. All right, so we can then put these together into what's called a file geodatabase. And that's the language that ArcGIS Pro uses for how it organizes things. A geodatabase is basically just a container that we're going to put stuff into. And in ArcGIS Pro, it's now a little bit simpler. It used to actually store things into a Microsoft Access database. Has anybody done any work with databases? Either in some other class? What kinds of databases?
Access certified.
Oh yeah, okay. So you can still do stuff with that, but ArcGIS doesn't use that as the underlying format for the data. There's still SQL language in there, and you can still query a database and do some of those things. So if you know how to do some of those things, it'll be a little bit of an advantage. Everybody's going to know how to do this. But right now, the file geodatabase, it's basically just a folder, all right? I mean, you guys organize things in your computer using files. All right, good. You don't have to, but it helps. And so everything's going to go into a file on this, and it's going to store it there. Now, it's basically a Windows folder, but it's a little bit more complicated than that because there's lots of files that get thrown into there, and if you start messing around inside your geodatabase, you can break your project, and then you might have to delete some data or start over depending on what you do. So you kind of leave your geodatabase alone and let ArcGIS Pro manage it. But you just basically throw all the data that you want into your file geodatabase, and it can store it there. And it can store any kind of data, almost any kind of data that you're going to be able to put into ArcGIS. You put it into your file geodatabase. We'll talk a little bit later about organizing this, but this could be just tables that don't have geographic data associated with them. It could be raster data, so there could be images in there of one form or another, just any kind of raster data, and polygon features that then, and in different cases, you can start to tie these things together. So we'll talk about how we join or relate tables in our database so that you may have one source of data that tells us one thing and the geographic data, and we want to put them together. That's a lot of data management, database kinds of tools, skills that we're going to need to learn how to do. And that's how you do GIS stuff. So in this particular case, the geographic information is linked to this table. Well, there's actually geographic information in this table as well, but this table has been searched, or it's been selected and identified 3 particular places that generate some amount of pollution. And they're along this river here, that's the Mississippi River, Minneapolis. They're in here, and so we may have identified them using GIS, or we may have identified them ourselves. Anyway, we can select out those data and look at them. We can actually create separate layers from them. We do lots of different kinds of things with them. So once we've built up our GIS database, we can start to look at the data, and we can visualize data in different layers. We can combine things together. We can play around with lots of different ways of visualizing data as well in order to illustrate whatever it is we are interested in, and getting things ready so that we can run some kind of an analysis. And so this map shows different kinds of data sources. If we look a little closer here, we have different census tracts, and these are organized by poverty level. We also have the amount of pollution that's being produced. And so one of the kinds of analysis that we could do based on these data, so here's a little bit zoomed in on the map, is comparing the poverty level of the area within 2 miles of a pollution, an area producing pollution, to the poverty levels outside of that area. And so these, the red dots are the polluting companies. The poverty level is shown in the color scale of the census tracts, so that's what these polygons are in here, and then these have been masked, or mask is a good enough term. We've basically drawn a circle around those of 2 miles, and then the power of GIS is that it can actually go in and average these values of everything that touches this. You can cut cut things out and look at it in lots of different ways. There's lots of different kinds of statistics you could do, but in this particular case, if you were interested in showing that polluting companies are located in poorer neighborhoods, you've pretty well demonstrated that the population within, the percent of population living in poverty within 2 miles is 23.25%. The population living in poverty outside of that area is less than 10%. And so there's a disparity there. And that's one of the things that you can easily do with GIS. Start to look for patterns and look for differences and look for disparities that happen because of that. And so you could do this for socioeconomic data, you could do this for health data, you could do this for biological data if you wanted to know where a particular species is located. Or look at habitat ranges of endangered species and their proximity to urban centers. That might be really important if you were concerned that this whatever endangered species might get ran over by cars. So trying to think about identifying new places that it could go that it wouldn't get ran over by cars. So kind of the sky's the limit and all different kinds of things that you can do. All right, so that's what I had for today.